Welcome to this very short lecture about how we read files in Python to get data to do stuff. All right, in this lecture, we're going to describe what a file is, identify the difference between text and binary files. Then we're going to learn how to open, read, and close a text file because all three of those steps are necessary. Then we're going to learn how to use the with keyword to auto-close the file because that's important. And then we're going to learn how to use the for loop to read the lines from a file. Like I said, this is going to be really short because it's really just kind of like code snippets, but understanding how a file works and how we access it, that's the most important part. The code is actually really simple. So let's talk about files, even though you probably understand what they are, like on your computer and stuff. Let's take a little bit of a deep dive here. A file is just data managed by a file system. And the file system is owned by the operating system. So your operating system determines what kind of organization the data has on the drive, on your persistent storage. And so a file system is just how that data is organized in your persistent storage, on your hard drive, on your SSD, on your USB drive, anything that you can save things to and it stays there, like save a file there, has a file system on it. And that file system figures out where that data is stored and how it is stored. Now, files also have names like testprogram.py, and these names have two different parts to that. There's the stem, which is the part all the way up to the first period, because some files have more than one period. And then there's the suffix, which is the dot, the period, and anything after it. So in this case, our stem is test program, and our suffix is .py. And so these are just important words to know here because later we might be interested in using them. So there are really two types of files that are stored on your on your hard disk. There are binary files, which are just like bibs and bops. Look at this over here. It's a bunch of periods and spaces and weird letters and whatever. And when you look inside here, it looks like this. It looks zob, 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 f, 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 f. It looks like this. And binary files are things like, MP4 files for, movies and audio, and, things like docx files, which are docx files, which are for Microsoft Word, and zip files. All of these are binary files, which means if you open them up, you cannot read them. Cannot read them. Okay? So what's this file here? This is pythonprogramming.doc. This is actually the Microsoft Word document that is the syllabus for this class. Text files, on the other hand, when you open them up, it's just text inside here. Look at all of this stuff going on here. This right now, this is lecturetheme.css, which is a file that I use to style all of these slide presentations I do for you. Over here on this left-hand side, this is just text. I can read everything in here. General set teens, theme UHV, -- gold, -- base font size. Okay. So over here, we know it's text. When the file system looks at it, it's still just a bunch of numbers, but we tell the file system that we want to open it like a text file. And then when we read it in, it's text. And so we can actually use them as strings in our programs. So we'll only be dealing with text files. Binary files are beyond the scope of this module. From Python's point of view, there are three steps to working with files, to read from them. First, we open the file to get a file object, and that file object is a return value, so we have to put it in a variable. Then we use functions or methods on that file object to read from the file, and then we have to close the file. And it's very important to close the file because if you don't, you can lock a file so that it never can be opened again unless you reboot your computer, which used to happen on Windows 95 and Windows 98 and Windows ME. Old versions of Windows, so easy to lock a file, you'd have to reboot your computer. As a programmer, it just sucked. Now I want to just take a little bit of a deeper look here. When we open a file here, what happens is Python asks the operating system, asks OS for access to the file. Access to the file. And the reason it has to do this is, remember, who owns files and file systems? That's the operating system. The operating system checks permissions. It checks to make sure that you can do it, okay? So checks permissions, perms. If everything is okay, then the OS returns what's called a file handle. A file handle, like that. And then Python takes that file handle, and what it does is it turns it into a file object, so that we can use it in Python. If OS, let's say the file doesn't exist, at this point, what happens right here is, if we don't get that, the OS, if the file doesn't exist, the OS will throw an error. It'll be like, here's an error code, buddy. Here's an error code. And then Python takes that and raises an exception. Can you guess what kind of exception it would raise? If you guess something like file not found error, which is raised when a file or directory is requested but doesn't exist, that's it right there. And what the operating system is, the operating system gives this error, ENOENT. That's just the name of the error that the operating system gives. And so Python creates a file not found error and raises that. So reading an entire file is really easy in Python. Here are the 3 lines of code it takes. We call the open function, which is built into Python. We tell it that we want to use the data.txt file. And right now Python's just like, okay, that's the file. R means we want to read it. Okay, reading. And then we tell it we want the encoding UTF-8, which turns it into a text file. So this is how we tell Python that we expect a text file. This returns a file object. So there's a file object stored in data. Then we can just call data.read. And that reads all of the file into a variable, contents, as a string. What happens if it's a large file, do you think? If you thought about, we could run out of memory, we could totally run out of memory. So we would end up with a memory insufficient error. And then finally, after we're done reading it and doing all the cool stuff, we have to take that file object and call close on it. Okay? Don't forget close. If we want to read a file line by line, we do the same thing. We open the file given its name, we say R for read, and we tell it the encoding we want. Just always use UTF-8. There's no reason not to, unless you're on like an old Windows computer. Don't be on an old Windows computer if you can not be on an old Windows. Anyway, so now we have a text file. Data is also something, this file object here, this file object that's stored in data, this file object here, it also can produce a list of things. You can think of it as a list of lines in the file. And so what we can do is we can use for line in that list of lines inside that file, and then we can do things with each line inside that file. For in this case, I'm printing each line upper. And then, of course, we close that file object because we don't ever want to forget that. I've made a really big deal about not forgetting to call close, and so there's a way for us to use Python open function so that it'll always call close for us. It will auto close it. And what we do is we use the with block, which I believe is a new block for us. So it also ends with a colon over here because it has indented lines. It owns lines. What we do is we call the function, and that returns the file object. And the file object is something known as a context manager. You don't really have to know this, but only context managers can be used with the with block. And so we say with open that, and then the file object gets stored into the variable name after as. So it's kind of weird. The variable is to the right of the function. It's not like a normal assignment where the variable would be on the left of an equal sign. We say with open as, and then the variable name over here. And then once we have that, we come inside here, inside the with block. And so it loops over and prints all of those out. And then once the for loop is done, it goes to the next line. There is no next line, so it exits the with block. And when that happens, this file object will automatically get called .close. .close is automatically called on it. So if you're ever doing any file stuff on your own, I would totally recommend using with open as some data. Let's say you just want to read all of the contents of a file. Okay. So let's just say you want to do that. So instead of using this code here, you'd say with open this thing here, and then you would just do contents equals data dot read. Okay. And then you would have all of the contents in the file. And then the next line, you can do something with it outside of the with block. So over here on the with block, we could do something like contents. That's not actually a thing. What am I doing? I just erased everything. I didn't mean to. So don't do this. Do, contents is equal to data, which is the name of the file object. That's our variable, .read. And then outside of it, we could do something like print contents like that. Okay. And so contents gets set inside the with block, and then we can use it outside of the with block. Okay. So that's how you would read an entire file and then do something with it. Have it auto close because of this with block. And that's it. Describing what a file is data in persistent storage owned by a file system managed by the operating system. The difference between text and binary files are text files contain text and binary files contain whatever. To open, read, and close a text file, you use the open function to get a file object, then .read to read all of the contents, or you can loop over it line by line, or .close, and then you call .close. You always call .close unless you're using a with block. And then you can loop using a for loop for the line inside your file object. Like this, it just loops over the lines, and then you can use the with block to auto close this file object here. You can do whatever you want inside here, but then once we get outside of the with block to the next line, this will call f.close. And that's it. I mean, everything else is just like using variables and changing strings and doing data, which is not about files. That's about Python. So opening and reading and closing a file, that's it. It's not that hard.